As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So the U.S. and its allies are worried that Ukraine's stalled counteroffensive means the war between Russian and Ukrainian forces will be an open-ended conflict. And this is according to a report from the Wall Street Journal that was published on Tuesday. The report said the U.S. was hoping that Ukraine would regain some territory, and that would pave the way for a negotiated settlement. Although, I find it hard to believe that the Biden administration is really thinking about diplomacy at all, since it has discouraged negotiations throughout the war. But President Biden did say earlier this month, quote, "My hope is and my expectation is you'll see that Ukraine makes significant progress on their offensive and it generates a negotiated settlement somewhere along the line," end quote. But without any significant Ukrainian gains, the West is preparing to support the proxy war against Russia for years to come. So an unnamed Western diplomat told the Wall Street Journal, quote, "The only real response is an industrial mobilization that will give Ukrainians and the Russians a clear message that the Ukrainians will always have plenty of what they need," end quote. So this diplomat said that the U.S. should, get ready to accept that the war will not end anytime soon. Biden administration officials have repeatedly said that they're willing to arm Ukraine for as long as it takes, but it's unclear if the U.S. and its NATO allies can sustain support for Ukraine, as officials are warning Western military stockpiles are running low. So you notice what that Western diplomat said that they need an industrial mobilization, and that has all sorts of implications if it's something the U.S. would, invoke the Defense Production Act. I think those are ideas that they're talking about right now within NATO is, turning car factories into ammunition factories like they did during World War II. All right, the next one here is some bad news. Victoria Nuland promoted to acting Deputy Secretary of State. So this article is from Responsible Statecraft from Connor Eccles. In a little remarked move, the Biden administration announced Monday that Victoria Nuland will take over as the acting second-in-command at the State Department. She replaces Wendy Sherman, who plans to retire at the end of this week. I didn't see this reported anywhere else, and they linked to here an announcement from Blinken saying how great Wendy Sherman is. She's the Deputy Secretary of State, and he mentions that Victoria Nuland will be replacing her as the acting Deputy Secretary of State. Nuland's appointment will be a boon for Russia hawks who want to turn up the heat on the Kremlin. But for those who favor a negotiated end to the conflict in Ukraine, a promotion for the notoriously undiplomatic diplomat will be a bitter pill. And I certainly agree with that sentiment. So a few quick reminders about who Nuland is. When she was serving in the Obama administration, she had a now infamous leaked call with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. So this was as the Maidan was going on, the coup in Ukraine. And she was speaking with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and expressed support for putting Arseniy Yatsenyuk into power. And then just later that month, Yatsenyuk was the prime minister of Ukraine in the post-coup government after they threw out Yanukovych. And at one memorable point in the call, Nuland said F the EU in response to Europe's softer stance on the protest. So the controversy surrounding the call and the larger implications of U.S. involvement in the ouster of Yanukovych kicked up tensions with Russia and contributed to Putin's decision to seize Crimea and support an insurgency in eastern Ukraine. And, this all sparked that war in eastern Ukraine, this coup. So her handing out of food to demonstrators on the ground in Kiev, everybody knows about that. Victoria Nuland was walking around handing out cookies to protesters. You just imagine a protest in Canada or something, and there's Russian officials walking around handing out treats. It's just, we can't even wrap our minds around that. So Nuland, along with State Department sanctions czar Daniel Fried, they then led the effort to punish Putin through sanctions. And she's known to be, basically the hardest line official on Russia in the Obama administration at the time. Now it's tough to say. I mean, you have Blinken and Sullivan there, very hard line as well. So Nuland's hawkish inclinations continued after she left the Obama administration back in 2020. She penned a foreign affairs essay titled Pinning Down Putin, in which she called for a permanent expansion of NATO bases in the alliance's eastern flank. And she was also opposed to the idea of extending the New START treaty, or a free rollover of the New START, as she called it. And that was the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia that President Biden and President Putin renewed in 2021. So since returning to the State Department under President Biden, she has showed little interest in a dovish turn. In an interview earlier this year, Nuland called Putin a 19th century autocrat and justified Ukrainian attacks in Crimea, which Russia has called the Red Line. She said that the U.S. supports Ukrainian attacks in Crimea. So with U.S.-Russia tensions at their highest point in decades, Russia knows exactly who Nuland is. This is going to be received, very negatively in Moscow. China hits back at Japan over Taiwan comments. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry on Tuesday hit back at Japan over comments made by a Japanese official about Tokyo potentially assisting Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack. So Toshiro Ino, who's Japan's Minister of State for Defense, made the comments in an interview with The Telegraph that was published on Sunday. He said that if countries around the world support Taiwan like the U.S. and its allies are backing Ukraine, then it would be very possible that we will provide some kind of support to Taiwan. He said that he's unsure if it would mean military aid or other types of support. He said, quote, "I am not sure at this juncture whether it is going to be defense equipment support or whether it is going to be logistics support," end quote. So responding to these comments, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning warned Tokyo to stop playing with fire on the issue of Taiwan. She said, quote, "The remarks of the incumbent high-level official of Japan's Defense Department constitute blatant interference in China's internal affairs," end quote. She said that the comments have a damaging effect on the political foundation of China-Japan relations. She reaffirmed China's desire to bring Taiwan under its control, saying the, quote, "complete reunification of the motherland is the common aspiration of all the sons and daughters of the Chinese nation and an unstoppable historical trend," end quote. Japan is currently undergoing a major military buildup to bring its total military spending to over 2% of its GDP over the next 5 years, up from 1% of its GDP. The buildup is being done in the name of countering China, as the government of Prime Minister Fumio Kishida released a national security strategy that called Beijing the biggest strategic challenge, and that is echoing language in U.S. military strategy documents. And of course, the U.S. is encouraging all of this. They're encouraging Japan's military buildup and encouraging Japan to boost military ties with other nations as its efforts to build alliances in the region. And this policy breaks from Japan's post-World War II constitution that was imposed by the U.S., that says Japan can only have a military for self-defense. Now they're buying, long-range missiles, so this is a big aspect of what is happening over there. All right, the last story here in the news section: the U.S. will not be cutting military aid for Israel, which probably doesn't sound like news. So while the Biden administration has expressed concern about the judicial overhaul being pushed forward by the Israeli government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, it has made clear U.S. military aid to Israel will not be affected. This is State Department Deputy Spokesman Vedant Patel. He said on Tuesday, quote, "There is not going to be any cut or stoppage of military aid, and that is because our commitment to Israel and our commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. Our decades-long partnership with Israel is ironclad," end quote. So the U.S. provides Israel with $3.8 billion in military aid each year. So his comments came a day after Israel's Knesset voted to abolish Israel's reasonableness standard, which eliminates the Supreme Court's ability to block government decisions it deems unreasonable. The law passed amid massive demonstrations against the judicial overhaul in a vote of 64-0, as the opposition did not vote in protest.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Again, it's the devolution of society. And it's right there in front of our eyes. Blimpitis. Yep. And again, I make this very clear why this happens, and I'm hated for saying this. It's when mommies stop raising their babies. You gotta go to work. You gotta go to work. If you don't go to work, you're a jerk because you're smarter than men. Oh, and if only women were in charge, there wouldn't be any wars. Yeah. Like Samantha Powers, not a war that she didn't love. How about Hillary Clinton? Forgot Margaret Thatcher. What about Madeline, not all that bright? Oh, I forgot about Condoleezza Rice. What about Susan Rice? When mothers stop raising their children and putting them in daycare centers for children, which are nothing more than old age homes, putting them in a nursing home. That's all daycare centers are, nursing homes for children. And you got a stranger feeding your kid crap. Can't understand why everybody blimped out. Listen, if I get elected, I want a fat tax. The more you weigh, the more you pay. I don't want to pay for your blimpitis. And again, all the talk about the COVID war, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 61% of the 1 to 17-year-olds who were hospitalized were obese. Can't figure it out. Oh, you mean the people that were dying from COVID, type 2 diabetics, people suffering from respiratory ailments, obesity? Don't talk about good health. You are banned. You are not allowed to speak about natural healing. Again, one of the books I've written, along with international bestseller, Trends 2000, my favorite, with Susie Gave Honey Boy. You still can get that one at trendsjournal.com. And trend tracking, far better than Megatrends Time magazine. And the first book I worked on, 1988, a Warner book, Natural Healing. And I have an honorary doctor from the National University of Health Sciences. So an ugly fuck face like that guy, Hotez or whatever he is. Oh, 200 people, 1,000 people would have died that died needlessly if they didn't get the shot. Oh, the Operation Warp Speed gene therapy inoculation ever first injected into a human being. Oh, that one rather than natural healing. Fuck off, Salenti. Why eat properly? Why take good care of yourself? Oh, how about that drug that they're all selling, huh? Oh, this is in the Cartoon News Network. Front page story. They took blockbuster drug for weight loss and diabetes. Now their stomachs are paralyzed. Why, that's misinformation. How dare you say anything about the drug dealers? The FDA approved it. The scumbags in the revolving door, like that fucking prick who was the head of the FDA in the tobacco pot and got a job with Philip Morris. It's one revolving door. Not only there, look at the guy that's playing our defense secretary, Lloyd Austin. What was his last job? Oh, he sat on the board of directors of Raytheon, the second largest defense contractor. So there you got it. Blockbuster drugs for weight loss and diabetes. Now their stomachs are paralyzed. And we've been writing about this in your Trends Journal week after week. And we have articles by Dr. Joseph Mercola and others about how to stay healthy. How much is the Federal Reserve going to raise interest rates? The guess on the street, 98% are saying they're going to raise them 25 basis points. And now it's a guess whether they're going to raise them again. So it's very simple. When they stop raising interest rates or say they're going to stop raising interest rates, the dollar is going to decline. The dollar is only strong because interest rates are high. And death of the dollar, a number of articles in this Trends Journal showing where it's going and why. So now, when interest rates go down, the dollar goes down and gold prices will go up. And interestingly enough, oil prices are going back up. You go back several weeks ago, they were around $70 a barrel for Brent crude. Now, today, they almost hit $83 a barrel. Back down a little bit, about $82.30 something a barrel for Brent crude. This week, last week, oil prices went up in the last several days in the United States. The gas prices at the pump went up over 6 cents. Yeah, it's down from the high of last year, but it's still high. And it's going to get higher. It's going to get higher for 3 reasons. Number one, supply is going down. Demand is moving up a bit. The 2 reasons that no one's talking about other than us, the Middle East meltdown. You saw what's going on in Israel. And we have a number of articles going on about the apartheid state of Israel. Yes, that's what we call it because that's what the UN calls it. And that's what human rights organizations call it. And we call it that too. And Phil Giraldi, former top CIA guy, the guy that walked into little Georgie Bush's office back then and gave him the data showing there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Yeah, that Phil Giraldi, who spoke at one of our rallies last year, he has an article too about what's going on in Israel and how bad this thing is going to get and why. So, as I say, when all else fails, they take you to war. So watch for the United States and Israel ramp up tensions against Iran, and the Israelis ramping up tensions and killing more Palestinians and possibly going into Lebanon. They will get the people's minds off what's going on in Israel as hundreds of thousands of people are taking to the streets in protest about the judicial reform acts that they just pushed through. Then the Ukraine war is heating up. Ukraine announced that they're going to be bombing more and more Moscow and Crimea. The more that they send bombs and missiles into drones into Russia, the more Russia's going to ramp up the war. Oil prices? Yeah. How about the price of life on Earth? And then articles on the presidential reality show about a half of U.S. voters say they're open to a third party. And by the way, bye-bye DeSantis. I think a quarter or a third of his staff is gone already. And this guy's going nowhere fast. So also, remember on August 6th, coming up soon, I'll be speaking at the Humanity for Peace rally. And that's at the United Nations. So try to be there. Go to their site, Humanity for Peace. Support peace because we're doing everything we can. And a bunch of great speakers will be there, including Scott Ritter, my buddy. And of course, you know the way I feel about politicians. And that's why we have these shirts.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
You pointed out in your article that a coalition of 13 Republican state attorneys general sent a letter to the CEOs of all Fortune 100 companies. What was that letter all about?
So, yeah, there's been a couple of major developments, I think, in the pushback against DEI. And, it's worth setting the table here, Tom, just for a second, if I may. This is all happening in the aftermath of the long overdue overturning of so-called affirmative action at the U.S. Supreme Court, which happened under a month ago, still at this point. It was towards the end of June. And after that, the question many of us had is, okay, we have finally seen this vindication of a colorblind constitution, of a colorblind Title VI when it comes to affirmative action. It took way too long. I mean, the road from Brown versus Board of Education to Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill took almost 70 years, 69 years, if my back of the envelope math is correct. And the question many of us had is, okay, now this happened, what's going to come next in the fight for colorblindness and the fight against race consciousness and the fight against racial determinism? Frankly, in the fight to uphold Martin Luther King's vision that we are judged not by the color of our skin, by the content of our characters, and the fight against the Ibram X. Kendi anti-racism intersectional vision, which frankly is kind of just the bastard flip side of the same coin, if you will, of John C. Calhoun's own form of racial determinism and race centricity in the antebellum years. That really, frankly, is what you saw, actually, from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in her horrible dissent in the affirmative action cases. And to your point, I've been delighted that there's been a couple of major letters that have been written just over the past few weeks in the aftermath of the affirmative action cases. So one was written by a coalition of 13 Republican state attorneys general. It was led by Chris Kobach of Kansas and Jonathan Skrmetti of Tennessee. And they wrote this letter to the CEOs of the Fortune 100 companies. And they basically, just to kind of briefly quote the letter, were trying to, quote, remind the CEOs of their, quote, obligations as employers under federal and state law to refrain from discriminating on the basis of race, whether under the label of diversity, equity, and inclusion or otherwise. And they cite Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And the upshot, the point of this letter is, and Tom Cotton, the esteemed senator from Arkansas, sent a very similar letter to 51 of the largest global and national law firms, also mentioning the plain text of both Title VI and Title VII. So very similar letters that they were sent to the Fortune 100 and big law, basically, warning them about DEI and warning them that these roving commissars, these roaming bands of diversitycrats who exist in Title IX offices on university campuses, who exist in the HR divisions of God knows how many corporations and law firms and whatnot throughout America, basically warning them that to the extent these DEI offices are actually discriminating on the basis of race, which they pretty much almost all are because that is their reason for existing, then they are flouting the law and that they are thereby put under scrutiny, that they will be scrutinized by these attorney general and by the members of Congress for purposes of lawsuits, investigations, subpoena power, all of the above. And it's not clear exactly how much more we could ask for at this exact stage. Ideally, we would like to see some litigation to kind of ultimately extirpate this horrible cancer of DEI from our nation. But for right now, this was a heck of a start, and I've been quite pleased with it.
All right, let me play devil's advocate here a little bit. I am more opposed to affirmative action than basically anybody. I mean, I yield to nobody in my opposition to it. I think it's destructive for absolutely everybody involved. There are very, very few clear and unambiguous beneficiaries. I mean, maybe people who staff the bureaucracies of the affirmative action establishment, maybe they benefit, but I don't think anybody else really benefits from it. But having said that, the real problem with DEI is that if I have a firm and I decide I'm going to hire exclusively on merit, and if that means that my workforce is not in direct racial proportion to the proportion of the various races in society at large, I can get in trouble. I can wind up with the Justice Department knocking on my door, the Civil Rights Commission, or whatever it is. So the real problem then is that I have to hire under duress, basically. I can't just consider merit. I have to consider, well, I don't want to be sued. I don't want to lose my livelihood. I don't want my reputation destroyed. So I have all these other considerations that go into the hiring process. So to me, the big problem is we have this enormous anti-discrimination bureaucracy that stifles the labor market and makes it irrational. So to me, I would be quite satisfied, even though I know a lot of people will still make stupid hiring decisions, if we simply said, you can hire on whatever basis you want, and if it comes out that it's not exactly even, if you don't have 12% black or this or that percent of whoever, you're not going to get in trouble. I'd be satisfied with that. But it seems like these Republican attorneys general are saying, no, we want to keep a huge bureaucracy overseeing the hiring process all over America, except this time we're going to make sure that it conforms to our principles. How about we just say, go ahead and hire anybody you want to hire, and you have to live with the consequences?
I mean, that's fine as a first principle. I mean, that's basically the Barry Goldwater stance in 1964, and that's a perfectly legitimate libertarian stance to take as a matter of political philosophy and public policy. That is entirely the ambit of the Congress to make those decisions. The ambit of the attorneys general is to enforce the law, and it is certainly the ambit of these Republican conservative attorneys general to try to enforce the law and to do their best within their own limited ambit of their own constitutional authority to try to enforce the law in a direction that will kind of nudge the polity, that will nudge the legal culture towards a system where we do not judge people on the basis of race, and extending, if they can, the holding and the ruling in Students for Fair Admissions in a salutary direction.
Well, the very day that the decision was handed down, I got an email because I'm on Harvard's mailing list as an alumnus. I got an email from them in which, I mean, it was like tearful. They were beside themselves. They hardly knew what to do. But if you read the wording of it, it was quite brazen. In effect, what they were saying is, we have a lot of smart people over here at Harvard, and we're going to put our heads together and basically figure out a way to get around this. That was the way I read it. I don't know if you saw it also, but I read it as, we are going to figure out a way around this where technically we are in compliance, but maybe in the spirit of things, and if we're being honest with ourselves, we're not. Do you think there's wiggle room for them, or what do you think they're going to try to do?
Yeah. So I saw that same email, and it was not a good email. You are right to flag it. You are totally correct to do that. Look, I have no doubt that there are any number of kind of miscreants and malefactors in higher education, which itself has increasingly become a monolithic cesspool of liberalism and elite progressivism. I have no doubt that there are any number of people in admissions offices who are going to try to flout or undermine, more subtly than openly flouting perhaps, the rulings in Students for Fair Admissions. And it's ultimately going to come not just on attorneys general, not just on prosecutors, although they certainly have a role to play here as well, but it's ultimately going to come on we the people to try to an extent, self-police, to try to file lawsuits that could deter poor actions, bad actions by these officers, and from trying to undermine effectively the ruling. What I mean by that is university admissions officers, this is a key point, and this is kind of why I take a glimmer of hope. It's important to note that university admissions officers, post Students for Fair Admissions in this new world that we are living in, they are personally liable for monetary damages under the civil rights statutes, 1981, 1983, and so forth, if they are found liable in court for actually using race when it comes to admissions decisions there.
I remember when Ruth Bader Ginsburg said things like, I admired her because she fought for what she believed in. And I don't know if the word is taunt, but let's say I would reply to people like that on Twitter, and I would say, that just goes to show that most people have no idea what the role of a Supreme Court justice is. It's not your role to, quote, fight for what you believe in. But I think that kind of advocacy and activist mentality is what yields you a regime like DEI, in which a lot of the courts will uphold this and pretend that it's normal and that it's perfectly okay to persecute a firm that isn't actively engaged in it. It's that. And the idea that actually the purpose of the Supreme Court is to interpret the law. It's not to, quote, fight for what you believe in. I mean, I know that sounds plausible, but that is not the point of it.
Yeah, look, I mean, some of this is just bread and butter separation of powers stuff. I mean, the Congress makes the law, the executive branch enforces the law, and the judiciary interprets the law. I mean, we've all read that famous quote from Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78, where the courts have neither force nor will, but merely judgment, and depend upon the efficacy of the executive branch, even for the enforcement of their own opinions. And by the way, that's kind of why Article 3 judicial opinions, or court opinions more generally, are just called opinions, because it is the opinion of the court and is trying to persuade other actors in the system as to the correctness of the adjudication, as to the correctness of the ruling, and thereby in trying to persuade the executive branch, hoping that the executive branch, due to its own goodwill, will choose to enforce that decision rather than to flout it, like Andrew Jackson did back with the Trail of Tears and other various examples like that.
I mean, what do you think? Do you think you should go if you were advising him, if he called you up?
Well, I wouldn't have a strong opinion. I probably would lean toward it because I generally have had a rule that the other candidates are irrelevant.
Yeah, true.
Or talk about the issues and how maybe, there's 6 or 7, and I say, I think the monetary policy is very important, and the rest of the candidates generally still have strong support for the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
Put them in a block and,
that's true.
and not worry about the personality. But the media loves the personality, and the politicians tend to as well.
I think the tide is turning. I mean, after we've talked about it so many times, but after the Twitter files have been released and people know what's going on, people know that the government is colluding with business to censor and to destroy voices that they don't like, that don't support the government narrative. I think the tide is turning in our favor, turning against censorship, because I think Americans, for all of our faults, we instinctively bristle when someone tells us we're not allowed to hold a thought, or say a word.
I don't think most of the European countries wanted the war either. It's clear what happened, which is that, from the beginning, we promised in 1992. The Russian leadership said, we will move. This was Gorbachev. Said when the Soviet Union, he was getting ready to dismantle the Soviet Union, and he said, we're going to withdraw 400,000 troops from East Germany. and we're going to allow you to reunite Germany under NATO, which was a hostile army. That's a huge concession for them. The one commitment that we want, is what the Russians said, is that you will not move NATO to the east. James Baker, who was then Secretary of State under Bush, famously promised, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, since then, we've moved it 1,000 miles in 14 countries. Now, when we started that plan in 1997, Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense under Clinton, said to the Clinton administration, if you move NATO to the east, I'm resigning because you are forcing the Russians to come to war with us. George Kennan, who was the most important diplomat in American history, the architect of the containment policy during World War II, said the same thing. You do not need to make an enemy out of Russia. Russia should be treated the way we won the Cold War.
It gets complicated.
But that statement there is powerful. You could almost make a campaign. Of course, I remember somebody trying to make a whole campaign out of it. It was a very popular thing to talk about.
Right.
Bring the troops home. Why are we in the Middle East and all of this thing? So he does such a great job. And I bet Bill O'Reilly's going nuts because Robert was using history.
Yeah.
What right does he have to use history? You mean we promised that we wouldn't do this and we broke our promise? But there's not 2% of the American people that know that. And that is why, as far as the Democrats are concerned, and Republicans, that's a dangerous man out there telling the truth. And what if they find out it's all a fake war for other reasons? And then they wonder why you don't win fake wars. Well, you're not intended to win them.
Yeah.
They're intended to have another type of political system. And it's to perpetuate an empire, or protect it, or enlarge it. The fact that we didn't live up to our promises was to expand our empire. So we go from Eastern Europe over to, from Western Europe over to Eastern world, break down all our promises, and then they say, oh, those Russians, they're the ones who started all this. And then in 1992 that he mentions, what about 2014? It climaxed in a coup of a Russian, a government that was wanting to be friendly with Russia. But that is just absent from the debate, unfortunately.
And all Hannity can say was, well, but Putin's a monster. I hope he dies. And RFK said, okay, yeah, maybe that's true, but here are the other facts that are also important to know. You know, he's like,
I was asked, which one is worse, this distortion about, the mandates for COVID or the climate change people? Which one has been accomplished more, and why are they different? That sort of thing. They're exactly the same thing. Yeah. It's manipulation of public opinion to try to convince people that you better be scared because you need us. You need the real science. Oh, no, you don't need a real science. Science doesn't work. we have to give up on science, so we have to do the other things. But you do need help, and people have to be scared first. I still hear it from people that you think should be intelligent enough that there's something fishy going on here. But no, they'll do it. They'll say, no, maybe they are not perfect, but somebody has to protect us against these viruses and do all these things. And they're protecting us against all the enemies around the world as we manufacture the enemies. Yeah. We create the enemies. We're protecting ourselves from the Chinese. They're one bad group of people, is the claim. And of course, they're miles apart from where we are. But what are we doing? How many ships do we have over there in the South China Sea trying to provoke some activity there that will accelerate the fighting and the killing? And that is a real problem. But the people who are warning us of the problem are saying, that's why we have to do more. Yeah. We need more weapons, more money. And we have to scare the American people. The Chinese are guilty of everything. But just like Robert pointed out that it's not like we as Americans have been totally innocent and the Russians were at fault for the whole war. I mean, that's a stretch. And just like people finally woke up over COVID, they're going to wake up over this foreign policy as well. I think they've essentially woke up over the lies told to get us in the Middle East. Yeah. So far, Bush isn't going down in history as one of our great presidents, and he wanted to be a war president because he thought that was the road to greatness.
Yeah, what a creep. And we've all seen those photos of 10 or 15 Bradleys and Leopards all blown up. They tried to use it, but instead, and this is what's, I think, my prediction, and many others as well, when things continue to go badly, it's going to be all Ukraine's fault. Even though they were promised, we'll give you everything you need to win this war. Oh, you're starting to lose? Hey, it's all your fault.
You wonder, why do they do it? Why did the Ukrainians go along with this and get involved by being pushed by outsiders? But maybe it isn't just their ineptness in not following what they've been instructed, and they weren't good students and they're not using the weapons properly. Maybe they are obeying the higher ups. Maybe there's people who are pulling the strings that the purpose wasn't to have Ukraine other than a cesspool of fighting and killing between East and West and keep the precipitation of this going. But it's a starting of this. How did NATO manage to do that? they had to get a lot of people saying, oh yeah, well, I don't know how they get them because it already exists, the fighting between Ukrainians and Russia and all that. But the people get scared. Oh, I guess NATO will have to help us. But then there's sometimes when it gets so long, it's so stupid. It's hard for me that people would be that dumb to keep. How long? I mean, right now, not only have they run out of weapons, we're running out of money, and we're gonna run out of soldiers. Matter of fact, that's why we worried the other day about, are we going to need a draft, because nobody wants to join this army that participates in this.
Yeah, well, what's happening, the panic is happening now. The panic is happening because it's now obvious that the weapons are not very good. The Bradleys aren't doing well, the Leopards aren't doing well. All of the wonder weapons are not achieving what they were supposed to achieve. And now the tactics aren't working well. The way they've been trained, NATO trained them, is not working well. And at the beginning of this conflict, our friend Colonel Doug Macgregor said, he predicted this is going to actually be the end of NATO, the death of NATO, because they're getting into something that they simply can't win. And everyone thought he was nuts. I think every day that passes, more and more looks like Colonel Macgregor is right. And in fact, I'm going to close with that thought, because that reminds me to remind you that Colonel Macgregor will be at our conference. And won't you want a chance to listen to what he has to say now that he's been proven right, to say hello to him, to hear his speech. The conference is Which Way America. Colonel Macgregor will be joining Dr. Paul, myself, and many others to speak on where are we headed. And it's not just military, it's our domestic policy, our civil liberties.